Welcome back to the Enlightened Misfits podcast, this space where we bring light to the parts of ourselves that we were told to maybe hide or stay quiet or maybe just ignore and reclaim them as our power. This is your host, Lauren Perlingi, and today's episode is one of the many that all of you have been asking for, this raw, honest, deep human connection about intimacy, desire, and what happens when we spend years abandoning ourselves, our needs, and what we're, let's just quote unquote call it normal. So on today's guest, I have Xanet. Her journey is the intimate way that we are going to talk about her work that is not just powerful, but it is just mastery, and it is her story. Welcome, Xanet. So happy to have you here with
Thank
us.
you, Lauren. So happy to be here to talk about my story, to help people understand how to improve their love life, which is something I'm really passionate about.
Yes, yeah, and people have been asking for this, so I'm so super excited for this. So let's just jump right into because I told a little bit about your story. It has so many powerful different layers, and I cannot wait for the listeners to hear. So tell us a little bit about your story and you are today, and how it's gotten to where you and how you work with people today.
Great. So I guess the place to start would be that uh, I was married for 26 years and in a sexless marriage. And I know that from listening to some of your amazing other episodes, like talking about trauma, and is definitely something that has happened, on this podcast. And so I myself had experienced sexual trauma as a child, but it wasn't the traditional type of trauma. I think when most people think about trauma, they think about it from the perspective of sexual abuse, but we know that there's other types of trauma, including something called shame trauma, which is a big thing, especially in religious communities. That was not my experience being in a religious community, but there was a lot of shame for me around my sexuality as a young child, because very innocently I was discovered like by a friend's mother playing doctor with my best friend in first grade, right? And there was a lot of shame that was imposed upon me because of that. And some other experiences that I had, I guess I was very sexually curious as a child. But when all of that shame got layered over it, I became very anxious around sexuality and very shut down and disconnected from my body, to the point where I couldn't even really have intercourse without it being painful, which is a condition called vaginismus. And I basically took this into my marriage without having anyone who I could talk to about it. And I just kind of assumed this is the way it was. And so ultimately I ended up, staying in a marriage for other reasons. But there was no sex after my second child was born. And I was 28 when my second kid was born. And we pretty much didn't have sex for the next, I don't know, 18, 19, 20 years. Which for me felt like a huge relief, because there was a lot of pain around it. There was a lot of drama around it. There was a lot of trauma around it. But what happened, which is what happens very frequently in long-term relationships when the sex stops, is that the intimacy stops, the emotional connection stops. I would say that relationship was fraught anyway with really us not, well, we were just super young, right? And not knowing how to really be vulnerable, to talk to each other, to express, our actual feelings that were going on. So there was a lot of resentment that built up in the relationship, but we were great parents, so we stayed with our children. And I ended up leaving that marriage when I turned 50. So I'm 65 now. So my journey really started at the age of 50. And has continued over the past 15 years. And I think I essentially made the decision when I left the marriage that I needed to really take a hard look at what was going on with my body and my sexuality and my lack of desire. And, sex not only was painful, but I never even had an orgasm. So, I just looked at this thing called sex and I was like, okay, I think this is something I'm supposed to be doing. I think I'm supposed to be enjoying it. I want to be in another relationship at some time in the future. So I really need to look at me and see, what's wrong with Xanet. And that led me to really my spiritual and sexual awakening, which was a long sort of journey that took place over maybe, 7 years or so, through initially the door of Tantra and sacred sexuality, which was something I didn't know anything about, but I was introduced to by a lovely person who wanted to give me a night of goddess worship. He had just come from a tantra workshop with somebody I'd met when I was living in New York, and started dating. And that was the beginning of the journey. And it was an amazing night and a really interesting experience, very, very different than anything I had ever experienced before, a place where I felt safe. This particular man did not take his pants off. It was all about me receiving and allowing my body to be touched with my consent at my pace, where I really began to get a sense of like sensation, because I was so dissociated from my own body that I never really felt sensation in my body. I didn't really feel pleasure. I didn't really feel desire. So it was just like the very, very beginning. It was like a little bit of a spark of, oh, there's something else out here. And maybe I'm not totally broken, because I felt totally broken.
Yeah. Thank you for being so vulnerable and sharing that. I do know that a lot of the listeners, like I said earlier, had asked for, some of my clients have been asking for like this connection from that desire, that intimacy. And, like you just said, that it's all connected, right? But then
Right.
also a lot of, me having, me personally, also my experience with sexual trauma and going
Mm-hmm.
through a very similar experience and journey with my husband now. He's probably going to kill me when I say this, but I mean, I'm not going to go too involved. Like, I'm not going to get too personal, but
Right.
um, he had offered the same idea of tantric sex. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but I was like,
Mm-hmm.
what the hell is that? So I did a lot of research. He did too. And I realized, oh my God, I have the same I have this same wound around intimacy. And I'm thinking intimacy is physical, but it's
Right.
both. So for some of the listeners that maybe they are in a sexless marriage, and can you kind of
Mm-hmm.
go into like what the definition is of a sexless marriage? Does that mean that you don't have sex, period, or is there a certain amount of number that, I mean, obviously this can vary, but if
Yeah.
people are trying to figure out, is my marriage sexless, does that mean that they have sex one or two times? Is it that physical connection? Is it emotional, physical, and emotional, or is it all those layers build up over time?
Great question. Okay, so the definition, the accepted definition in the therapy world around a sexless marriage is a couple that's having sex less than 10 times a year. So essentially once every 6 weeks, right?
Okay.
Now, is your marriage sexless? There are couples that are having sex less than that, but they don't feel like they're in a sexless marriage because they're both okay with it, like for whatever reason, like we're okay if we only have, sex 2 or 3 times a year. So is it a sexless marriage? Yes, officially.
Yeah.
But if it's not a problem, it's not a problem, right? I think 90% of the time it's not a problem for one of the partners, but it is a problem for the other partner, right? And so that creates the conflict, and the tension. And it's very prevalent, Lauren. I mean, you yourself just talked about that, right? Like, it's almost like 1 in 5 couples experience a sexless marriage at some point in their relationship. And, there are periods of time, we all have our peaks and our valleys, right? There are periods of time when the amount of sex that you're having, actually decreases for whatever reason. There's physical things. I mean, I've got some health conditions going on right now, so my sex life is not exactly where I'd like it to be, right? But that's normal, right? That's part of life. But this persistent pattern of, and I see this all the time with couples who come to me to work with me on my retreats, is like, maybe we have sex on our birthday and our anniversary, right? And it's not just that they're not having sex, which is typically defined in the popular literature as, intercourse, right? They're not really having any intimacy. Any other type of, maybe they cuddle, but there's not a lot of touching. There's no connection. There's really no, way in which they're feeling physically connected. Because in my view, you don't have to have, what we call penis and vagina sex in order to have sex. You just have to be in some sort of erotic connection with your partner. You can have like the super hottest makeout session,
Right.
and that
Yeah.
counts, right? That counts. As not in my opinion, as not being in a sexless marriage, because there's connection, there's desire. You're turned on. You don't have to have a goal or an expectation. In fact, that's one of the things that really messes people up, is when they do have goals, and they do have expectations.
Yeah. Yeah. That's where, when my husband, I always think of this TikTok trend that it's like my current husband when I say that, but like he really is the husband now, because I had an ex-husband that I'm not talking about on the, that's not what I'm saying. So
Right.
that stems from a lot of my trauma too, but not for Joey, my husband. Now when he offered this idea, I realized this like a year ago. Oh my goodness, I do have a wound around intimacy,
Mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm.
I wanted to explore it. And it was like safe to explore it before, like when I would be like, don't touch me, like
Mm-hmm.
all of that stuff. And I'm only saying this now because we've healed that together. And I feel like you're right. Like through my perspective too, is intimacy is like that emotional connection, that physical connection. It's not, and when we did, when I learned more about tantric, I realized, oh, it's about the journey versus, not the
The
climax.
destination,
Or
right? Not
yeah,
the
like
destination.
yeah, like
Totally.
it's not like, oh, we're gonna get like this is just how we have to hurry up and get it done, because like
Right.
that in previous relationships, I didn't feel safe in my body, and all of the trauma build up that I felt like I had to do it, and then I would just literally numb myself to be like, oh, it's a chore.
Right.
And like it's different now that I, obviously have healed some of that. And I feel like a lot of people listening to this, just like from my conversations and just people listening to this now, 100% there's a lot of people right now that can resonate with this. So that's why I was like, I'm so
Okay.
excited to ask you all the questions because you're the expert. So, um, what was kind of like the catalyst for you that finally pushed you to leave that marriage? Like if somebody is listening to this
Yeah.
right now, like, oh my God, I feel so called out. That is literally me. What is kind of like that catalyst? Like, was it slowly unraveling, or when was there like one
Yes.
defining moment of clarity?
It did slowly unravel. I mean, I think I grieved for the marriage for a decade, to be honest with you, right?
Okay.
Like, and I don't think that's so terribly uncommon. But the moment of clarity was, it was our 25th wedding anniversary, and we were at a restaurant in New York, and sitting across from each other, and we basically had nothing to say to each other, which was very, very common for us, because they're just, we didn't have at that, especially at that point, our relationship was really pretty toxic. And I just like looked at myself, and I was like, there isn't going to be a 26th wedding anniversary. I'm done. I'm out of here. And that was the moment of clarity for me. I was, and, I waited until my kids um, were both in college. Which would I do that again? Maybe, I don't know. It's hard. It's hard for me to, assess that. But that was the moment of clarity. It's just like, I have to, I have to get out of this relationship, out of this marriage. We're both miserable.
Yeah. Now, was it mutually, like it was like a mutual decision, like it was no pushback, or you
No,
know,
it was totally mutual. We both
that's good.
we were both miserable.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, we were both miserable, and we were both lawyers, so we we just basically sat down with a yellow pad and just sit down, wrote, split the assets literally on a yellow legal pad when we decided to, when we finally had the conversation, which was still like 6 months after I made the decision um, to leave. But it was very amicable. We're still, we're still friendly.
That's
We
good.
still celebrate family events and things together.
Yeah. It's always nice when it's that amicably, like let's just
Yeah.
go this way. And also, like you just said, you're a lawyer. So it's like, oh, wow, we could just do this really easy. Yeah. So yeah, thank you for sharing. I know that
Yeah.
that was, that was hard for you and,
Yeah.
it started your journey. But looking back on that now, um, when you talked about that shame and carrying shame or maybe a sense of brokenness, I
Hmm.
feel like there's many people out here, and I don't want to label it as sexless relationships, but let's just label it that. And like, what would some internal narratives that you had kind of dismantled in order to heal and move on? Like, if somebody is listening to this, like, okay, so now what do I do? Like, I'm where she is now. What do
Yeah.
I do?
Well, I think it depends what you're coming from. If you're coming from a place where there was a lot of sexual trauma and you haven't experienced pleasure in your body, then it probably would benefit you to really do some exploration around that, right? So I'm a trauma practitioner as well.
Mhm.
And oh, excuse me. And Really unwinding that trauma and healing it is going to be a really important piece of looking into, whether it was abuse or shame trauma, would be an important piece of the healing journey, right? Which I went through myself as well. If it's that you're in a sexless marriage and there are other reasons for it and you've decided to leave, right? Then I think the internal dialogue is I deserve more, right? Like I deserve to experience pleasure. I deserve to experience intimacy. I am worthy, which I feel like a lot of women really struggle with around our self. We know that a lot of women have a self-worth wound, right? But I am
Right.
worthy of having the relationship that, where I feel seen, where I feel heard, where I feel really, loved in a way in which I haven't felt loved, and where somebody is actually helping take care of my needs. Because I think in a lot of relationships, this was certainly true in mine, I was like taking care of everybody's needs, my ex's needs, the kids' needs, right? Businesses' needs. But nobody was taking care of my emotional needs. And I think we all deserve to have, a partnership where it's truly a partnership and you both take care of each other's emotional needs. So I think that's some of the shame, some of the self talk. I think if you've experienced a lot of shame, religious shame, body shame, which is a huge issue for women often for women around their sexuality, not being able to relax into pleasure, not being able to enjoy their body, not feeling like they can actually express themselves fully sexually. Um, the best way to rid yourself of shame is honestly is to be able to talk about it with other people, because I think shame is something that is a very like individual solo thing. When we experience shame, we think we're the only person in the world that has ever had that experience. But when we start actually sharing our shame and talking about it, that actually changes things, because first of all we normalize it and we meet all these other people who are like, oh my god, that happened to me as well, right? And so we're no longer alone in that experience. We're now able to see that there are other people that have had that experience, which really starts to normalize it. No matter what type of shame you've experienced, you're never alone. And I think that's another really important, dialogue that you not need to have inside of yourself, whether it's writing about it and then sharing it, or finding some friends to talk about it, or going to a workshop, or, which there are a lot of these days, right? Where you can start expressing that. Going to a women's group. A lot of women's groups end up talking about sex, right?
Right.
Even if it's not meant to talk about sex, they end up talking about sex because that's what women tend to talk about often when we get together, our relationships and sex, right? And beginning to share some of that within the context of your community is really, really powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for saying that too. Cause I feel like when, just like looking back on like my relationships and my experiences, and plus I guess I should say just like my human experience, this far, there is a lot of, now that you're saying this, there was a lot of body shaming from my part, maybe from
Mm-hmm.
other people too. But I mean, like it started with me, right? Like it started with what I heard when I was a child, or, I've always dealt with weight issues. It's always, my weight was always up and down, or, like when I was very young, I was diagnosed with ADHD. So like I was put on medication. So like that
Mm-hmm.
suppressed my appetite. But then I was like taken off because I was too angry. And it was like this constant fluctuation of my weight. So it's like I never had the confidence. And then I'm like, oh, I'm
Right.
really skinny. But then I'm like, I feel so shitty. Like I'm the smallest. It was like, I still remember a couple of years ago, I was the smallest I ever was. You could look at my body and be like, oh, she's so skinny. She's, not, she's very fit. I was like, but then my everything else in my life was like trash pretty much.
Right.
So it's like, well, that's not it. So let me try this. And it's like, I am a little bit like, I should say my meat suit is a little bit fluffier now than it was. And I feel so much better. Like I don't, yeah, there's, some things I want to tone up. There's some things that I want to, release, and like I'm working through that. But it's like I don't talk to myself like that. And it's through, now that you're saying it, it's through my own shame wound that I would shame myself and then
Right.
try to look from validation from a partner that would also just make me feel like shit anyway.
Right.
That's obviously not the case in my marriage now, but it was for a very long time. So I can see how that shame wound just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger to the point that I wouldn't be sitting here talking about my sex life before, like it would
Right. Right.
be shameful. And I did come from a very religious like shame, and you have to do it this way, and having a kid before you were married, and well, I was married, but like, should I have got married? No. Like then that it happened that like, oh well, you're married, you're fine. Like no, this should never have happened, but obviously it did.
Right.
Like
Right.
that
Right.
type
Right.
of thing
Right.
is like, this is not healthy, that type of thing. So
Yeah.
I feel like there's, like you said, after decades of that disconnection, like from your own perspective and how you work with clients, like how did you start to reconnect with your desires, your sexuality, or even pleasures, and what through all of this surprised you the most through this process?
Interesting question. Um, well, I guess, since I said, for me, I did this solo
Okay.
initially, right? I want to emphasize, right? Because I know there are some of you all who are listening who maybe have been in my situation and are thinking about like maybe this, the relationship has gotten to the point where it's so toxic that I need to move on. But in my experience, there's a lot of women who actually want to, and men who want to be able to reconnect with their partner. They want to feel that desire again, right? So I really want to be very clear. And the work personally that I professionally do is actually with couples primarily to help them refine that desire, that flame, that intimacy, like to see what's blocking and helping them really really reconnect. And I feel like that's a very healthy way to actually start to, heal a relationship and even heal sexual wounds around a relationship. So I really want to make that clear as a caveat. My own personal journey, though, was as an individual, because I had left the marriage. Um, that period of time. But I was very much in an exploratory phase. And I don't know that that's necessarily what everybody would feel comfortable doing and being in. I mean, I took a ton of workshops. I took tantra workshops. I took a bunch of sexuality workshops and trainings. I was living in California where there were a lot of these types of workshops and activities that does not necessarily exist in the rest of the United States. And that was my own journey of healing, of doing my own work, of putting myself in very edgy situations to allow myself to explore my deepest edges around sexuality and pleasure. Again, that was my journey. There's a small, and I really mean this, very small minority of people that would want to be on that journey. I know that for a fact, right? Because of all of the stigma associated with it and the shame associated with it and whatnot. So I don't want to like totally recommend that. I will say that, I've worked with women for many years of helping them open themselves up to their own pleasure and their own sexuality. And there are sex and intimacy coaches like myself who do work with women around that. And that work is very powerful, and it's done in a very boundaried way where you're actually, we're guiding, but you're doing your own self-work around that. So I think that that's an avenue to go down. But I think if you're still in the context and you're still in a relationship where you really love this person, but maybe you've just become roommates rather than lovers, then you need to start to have like a conversation about what's actually happening. And I think that for a lot of couples, starting that conversation is a really scary thing to do. And I get asked that a lot. Like, how do you start the conversation? So I have a great answer to that. Because I've thought about that and how hard it is to start that conversation. And this is something that I came up with, and I actually offer to like all of your listeners as well. You can go to my my website, which is howtoimprovemylovelife.com. And on that website, you're going to see a intimacy equation quiz. So this intimacy equation quiz is great, right? Because you get to, let's say you're the person who wants to start the conversation, but like, how do I bring this up to my partner? Which is the question I get all the time, right? Right. But you take this intimacy equation quiz and you begin to understand there's different, if you will, intimacy personalities. I don't know that personalities is a good way to put it, but there's different ways in which you express intimacy. So are you somebody who like trust and security is really important to, and that's what creates intimacy for you? Or are you somebody who adventure and and excitement, excuse me, is really important to you? Or are you somebody who like being really emotionally open and vulnerable, right? Sort of understanding the factors helps you have some language. And then you go to your partner and you're like, hey, I just took this kind of cool quiz around, what my intimacy formula is, because I was kind of curious. Why don't you take it, right? It's a way to start and it's a fun quiz, right? It has all this animated objects, it's a way, in a fun way and a non-threatening way, to start a conversation. Right. And I think that's really where things have to start, at the conversation level. Right. Having the ability to be able to say, like, hey, it looks like, you're like playful and adventurous. And for me, trust and safety is really important. What does that mean? How do we make that work in the relationship? And of course, if you take the quiz, you'll get a follow-up email with me exactly telling you how that does work. But I think starting that conversation is really important. And from there, you can decide what needs to happen next. Do we need support, right? As a couple, do we need support in our relationship to be able to understand what are our blocks to intimacy, what are our blocks to sexuality. Is this something that we can just do on our own, right? Once we start the conversation going, maybe we can get some relationship deck games, or right, there are a lot of self-help out there as well. Maybe we'll read one of Xanet's books. I highly recommend that. So there's a lot of possibilities, but you've got to get the conversation started.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. Like I was gonna literally ask you, okay, so what's the first step? So thank you for explaining all that for the first step, because I think that that is truly important. And from my experience, that's how we started. It was my husband bringing it to me, which I guess I was the person that didn't really know how to bring it up. And, here's me. I know a lot, but I didn't know how to bring that conversation up.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
fraught. It's fraught. It's a Pandora's box,
Yeah.
right? You don't know what happens. You're afraid of like what happens when I open up that box.
Right. Yeah. And I'm glad that he did have that conversation with me and bring that up, like being vulnerable. I have throughout we've been together for 3 years, so it's been hard for him to be vulnerable. And I'm really like, contrary to the popular belief, I guess, I am very vulnerable. But for that, I think it was just him having to initiate that, conversation, and
Right.
it like having to reconnect with that. So yeah, I definitely want to go take that quiz just because I'm curious. I mean, we've done, we actually are doing, a book right now, but I'm actually curious to see, has it changed since we started? Like
Yeah.
has things changed? So make sure if you're listening to this, you go check out her books too. I'll make sure they're in the show notes, or if you're watching this on YouTube, I'll make sure that they're there too, and her quiz, because I'm gonna do it. So I want you guys to do it too. So you said a little bit about when you're working with like
Mhm.
what is like the biggest myth about desire, maybe long-term partnerships or intimacy that you have came across? And like, what do you wish more couples,
Mm.
sorry, why can't I speak? More couples understood sooner rather than later?
Um, well, there's a lot of myths around intimacy and sex. I would say,
Like your biggest one, like the biggest one.
yeah. So I don't know that it's a myth, but I don't see this as a myth, but I do see this as the main problem. So I'm going to address it from that perspective. So
Yeah.
I think the main issue that couples have around their, struggling around sex, generally speaking, is not so much the sex itself, and that's a piece of it, but it's really around the emotional connection and lack of the emotional connection, because it's the emotional connection, the emotional intimacy that actually creates the safety to be able to be vulnerable enough during sex to be able to ask for what you want, to be able to be, interested and explorative, and not concerned that, sex is going to be used against you. And I feel like that's the biggest stumbling block that many couples have, is that they're not in a place where they really are great at communicating around feelings and what's actually going on for them. And because they don't communicate and they don't repair, they end up building up like resentments, right? And then the more resentments that get built up, the less safe it feels to talk about anything. And, it's just like you get into a hamster's wheel, essentially. And so I think that, like, for me personally, my new book is called The Sex and Intimacy Repair Kit for a reason. And the first 2/3 is about intimacy. And the the last part, third, last part is about sex, right? Because that piece is so critically important to really feel, connected to your partner, because sex is such a vulnerable place to be. It is. It's like, next to next to having a baby, which is probably the most vulnerable, way in which we're exposed, right? Being sexual with your partner is incredibly vulnerable place to be. And being, sexually, really in your body and enjoying sex and being able to ask for what you want and express your desires and not be afraid that if you're going to get rejected because your partner isn't in the mood, right, that just means that you're not somebody, that they're not into you, right, is like something that we get into our head and we start projecting the story, and then we get afraid because we've been rejected, and so we don't initiate again, right, and then the cycle just keeps on going.
Yeah. I think you just explained my entire life before, because that is literally, well, it was more of like, I was like, please don't ask me, please don't ask me, please don't, like, or, that type of thing. So like, I can see how what you just said was, that was my old, I should say, let me preface my old life, the old version of myself. But now it
Right.
makes sense. Like I'm having so many aha moments listening to you because I'm like, oh my gosh. So thinking about all of this, and before we wrap up here is, it seems like well, I should say, let me just talk from my perspective. So there's so many parallels between communication, intimacy, and entrepreneurship. And a lot of people that are listening to this are entrepreneurs. Like, so what lesson have you learned, or what lessons I should say, have you learned from maybe your sexless marriage or just on this journey of actually this helping you become a stronger businesswoman?
Oh my God, that's a whole nother podcast. So many. There are so many lessons I learned from being in a sexless marriage. That's actually like one of my signature talks. But let me just say a couple of them.
Okay.
I think one is you need to feel comfortable asking for what you want. And I think that's very important in business. I think again, as entrepreneurs, where we set our own pricing at strategies, et cetera, so often we leave money on the table. We devalue. This goes to the self-worth wound that a lot of women experience, right? We often devalue ourselves, right? So, asking for what you actually want, um, as opposed to what you think you need is different, right? So I think that's definitely one lesson that I learned. Another big lesson I learned, and again, we could talk 40 minutes about this, is the importance of foreplay, right? Especially warming people up. This is especially true for women as we age and our desire becomes more responsive, rather than spontaneous, which when we were younger and our hormones were raging and we were horny, or we're in a new relationship and our hormones are raging again because we have this new relationship energy, which sends all this dopamine to our brain, and sex becomes like crack, essentially, right? For a limited period of time. And then it goes away. And then you have to figure out, like, okay, now how do I actually like keep my desire up in this relationship? Well, okay, what was that related to? What did I just say? Foreplay, right. Um,
Perfect.
so same thing in business, right? I feel like you need to warm up your prospects. You can't just like, cold email people. There's a no like trust factor that's very, very important. And warming up your prospects, letting them get to know you through doing podcasts, through doing, YouTube videos, through emailing them on a regular basis, where you actually are not selling, but you're sharing vulnerably about something about your own life, your own experience. And then maybe there's a connection to your business there, but it's not a hard sell, right? I think is another really important thing that I learned about being in a sexless marriage. Also, we all have um, goals, which are important to have goals in business. But once again, just like in sex, and you actually said it beautifully, it's not the destination that's important. It's the journey that you're on. And I find that, in sex, if you are so focused on the outcome, I have to have an orgasm or we have to have intercourse, right? Then you miss out on the whole experience because
Right.
you're so focused on that goal. And it's the same thing, I think, in business. If you're so focused on a goal or an outcome, you tend to turn away from other opportunities that are knocking at your door. Oh, that's not where I'm headed. I need to go there. Right. And I think that sometimes we miss out on those opportunities that are right there because we're so focused on, I've got to get, whatever it is. So I feel like being more open to the journey, to what comes to you, is really important. And I learned that as well.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for explaining that all very beautifully because I also, through my own journey, realized, oh shit, my relationship is like literally like my business. And then, through my own journey, I'm like, oh, it's like a reflection of my relationship. And
Totally.
it's like, this is not working. This is not working. If my personal life is balanced with my business, like, it's just like, oh, it's, showing up as a mom or showing up as a wife or showing up as a business owner. It's like, how do I do all three? And it's like, oh, okay. Like, have more play, have more like, and I've said this to a client about, well, you just need more foreplay. And she's cracking up. And I'm like, no, I'm being dead serious right now.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
I'm being very serious. And she's like, I didn't look at that way. I'm like, of course not. You're taking everything so seriously. Like, stop taking it so serious, And it's like just being able to be more soft and more like gentle is
Hmm.
is what I being more softer with my daughter, being more gentle with I can come across very aggressive, like that energy, but it's just like that passion of like when I'm
Right.
speaking. And it's taken from my, daughter, like my husband of like, whoa, calm down. Like, but it's more of like that passion fueled place. And they are always reminding me, calm down, calm down.
Or and maybe it's more like, you're similar to me, right? Like I've had very strong, male energy, right? I'm a
Yes.
healthcare lawyer, right? Like lived in New York City,
Yeah.
workaholic, yada yada yada, right? It was very successful in that first part of my career, but it wasn't not successful in a relationship for sure. And it's not about intimacy, right? And so tapping more into the feminine side,
Right.
right? Of That's what you're basically talking about, right? Tapping more into your feminine side, Lauren, is where that surrender comes from, where that vulnerability comes from, where that softness came from. And that was a huge part of my journey. I think that was probably the most challenging part of my journey. But that came through me being able to really explore my sexuality, because that is our center of our creativity and our power, and that feminine side lives in our womb space, right, in our sexual energy.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's kind of like where I am currently, like doing, like currently just like learning about, because like I worked in healthcare. I wasn't a lawyer, but I worked in a healthcare as a high risk OB ultrasound tech. So like I have a lot of masculine energy. I always provided. I was always the one in the relationship that provided and doing all the things. And it's like, now I'm not in, I'm not in that space anymore. I'm more feminine. I'm more like building my business feminine, like in the feminine
Right.
energy, like learning all of that. It's like super fucking uncomfortable, but it's like seems so it flows better, it's easier, like it just, I want to say I can make it as easy as possible because I feel like if not, my ego is going to make it hard, like,
Right.
so it's like it's definitely it's a journey and it's a process, but I'm like I'm loving it because I'm learning so much stuff.
Yeah.
So I was
Yeah.
even now that I'm like, God, maybe I needed this conversation more than the listeners.
We all need this conversation because we don't talk about it.
Yeah. And I feel like it needs to be talked about more. And I feel like all of the conversations, or most of all of the conversations on this podcast, people are blown away by the stuff that we talk about. Cause I'm like, but that's the reason why I have my podcast. I want
Right.
my podcast to be the one that people go to listen to because they know they're going to get the raw truth and it's nothing's going to get held back. And I'm very vulnerable on the podcast too. Like if you want to come learn about my life, come go listen to my podcast, you know?
Yeah, I love it.
So before we wrap up, a message for anybody that is feeling stuck. So that person that's listening right now, who maybe feels disconnected, maybe ashamed, or maybe even just afraid to ask what they truly want, what is one truth that you can give them to walk away with today?
Well, first, I think they should go to the quiz, right, at howtoimproveMyLoveLife.com because I think that's going to be important. But I think the truth to walk away with, which is what I tell everybody, is that pleasure is your birthright. You are entitled to enjoy your body. You were born literally, we are the only mammals on the entire in the entire species that actually even have a clitoris. And it's only for the reason of having pleasure. And so it's really our birthright, right? And so if you're not getting that pleasure, if you're not experiencing it, then you owe it to yourself to really take a hard look and see, what kind of support that you need that's out there, because there's a lot of support that's out there. There are books, there are videos that you can come to one of my, couples retreats, right? Where I work with people, a couple individually over a 4-day period of time and really help them work through what's going on, and very interactive and experiential, right? So there's lots of opportunities, but you need to remember that pleasure is your birthright.
I love that. Pleasure is your birthright. Make sure you remember that. Everybody listening. Well, thank you so much for being here and receiving this conversation. And if you felt that your breath maybe has deepened a little bit, maybe your chest has softened and your energy just settles, I want to remind you that this is your body reminding you that connecting to your truth is truly meant to feel grounded but not heavy. And
Love it.
today's is a living example of this. And it's never too late to reclaim your voice, your desires, and your pleasure. And I feel like her little bit of the story that she talked to us today about or shared with us today is about healing is not about starting over. It's about coming home to yourself. So thank you so much for all of that. And again, like she said, make sure you go check out her quiz on her website. I'll make sure it's in the description box. If you're listening to this or if you're watching this over on YouTube, it will be, I should say, show notes. And then if you're listening to this on YouTube, it'll be all over in the description box. So make sure you click below the video that you're watching or you're listening. And if you loved today's episode, make sure you subscribe and share this with somebody that you feel that would gain knowledge from listening to this, because everybody in this world needs this message today. And I also wanted to invite you to join me inside the Enlightened Misfits Sisterhood. This community is for spiritual entrepreneurs rising into purpose. You can connect with me over on Instagram at The Mermaid Light, or my links are below in the show notes as well. I hope you have an amazing rest of your week, and I will see you next week.